And remained with him, of course, for the rest of his life. And she then acquires rather a bad reputation for being a very fearsome guardian of Frank Lloyd Wright's memory and his legacy. But she was very much involved, of course, with his trust and so on. They do have a child together, so that is his seventh child, Giovanna. Now, I also mentioned that there's a second fire in Taliesin, which was caused by an electrical fault. Apparently, much as he enjoyed modern technology, he was rather slipshod about his electrics, I think. And he then rebuilds what we saw yesterday, which is Taliesin Taliesin 3. Now, when he eventually does manage to marry Olgivanna, because he has to wait a year after divorcing Miriam Noel, by then, of course, we enter 1929, which is a frightening period of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and obviously that is not bringing in any jobs for Frank Lloyd Wright. So what they both decide on, what Olgivanna and Wright decide on, is establishing a fellowship. And in other words, it's a sort of, they established this architectural school, and it sounds a rather grand term to become a fellow under the aegis of Frank Lloyd Wright. But it was obviously a means of making some money to live on, because they accepted about 50 to 60 students a year, and you had to pay $600 for that, per annum, which today would be about $60,000, I would imagine. So it's quite a lot of money that they had to pay. And what they didn't perhaps realize at the time, was that they actually had to work very, very hard, not only at their architectural practice, but also actually as laborers. They had to go and milk the cows and hoe the fields and do all sorts of things, which in fact somehow created this wonderful community spirit, which hardly anyone dropped out. And I think he gave them a wonderful rounded sort of education one way and another. And what happens though with the fellowship, of course it starts in Taliesin, and then by the mid-1930s he decides to have a sort of winter residence in Arizona. So he calls it Taliesin West. And Taliesin West is outside Scottsdale in Arizona. And they obviously then, I don't know which month exactly, but probably in October, they all set off in a great trek from Wisconsin all the way down through the Central America to Scottsdale, to Taliesin West. He buys about 600 acres of land in this arid desert environment, and actually I think he's happiest of anywhere he's ever been in Arizona. He was very, very contented there. He found it a very relaxing environment, and he was endlessly altering and adapting and fiddling around with the building itself. So it was a work in progress. Every year when he returned, he would suddenly decide to do something new at Taliesin West. It is now obviously run by a trust, and it is visitable, of course, to the public. You can see it there, lying low in the desert environment, and here is another view looking towards the entrance. It's totally different. The horizontality is still there, of course. That's implicit in his architecture. But now we've moved away very, very dramatically from the sort of prairie-style house. This is much more of a sort of expanded version, but it's a very different feeling to it. And what is particularly interesting and so typical of Frank Lloyd Wright is that you have here what is the desert concrete. He and his students, well, probably the students, in fact, the fellows, will actually go off and search for these big, big rocks in the environment, in his 600 acres. And he creates then what is sort of this amalgam of rocks in concrete molds. And you see here that the desert concrete or desert rubble masonry. Which is very much a distinctive feature. They're very much, again, man aligned with nature, using the natural environment, using the materials that are available to you. And here again, you can see the main house with, of course, now on the left-hand side, the studio. the studio which is still functioning today. The School of Architecture at Taliesin still survives. And again, it still functions in both centres. It's this annual progression from the north to the south. So it still is a functioning organisation. And so the studio is still very much used on a biannual, half yearly basis. There's a studio inside. Now, originally, of course, because you're in a desert climate, you're in a very hot climate, he had canvas for the ceilings, for the roofing. He didn't have any, so the air could just filter through. Now, of course, with air conditioning, this is perspex in the ceiling itself. And there you can see the drafting studio, and here is a very early photograph of it being built, and you can see then actually these young men building, young men and women. I mean, it was unisex, but there they are building the building they're going to live in. So it was, and in fact, in consequence, apparently, an enormous amount of restoration has had to take place because I don't think these chaps actually know how to build anything at all. They built rather badly. But Taliesin West, as I say, is a very, very important landmark in his development by the mid to late 1930s. And as I say, he somehow found, perhaps because it was new, perhaps he could escape from all the horrors and tragedies that had gone before, that this was a new environment where he could simply be himself again, which was really rather a lovely aspect of his later life. And here you can see what is the reception area with the furniture that, of course, he will design. I mean, everything in Taliesin West remains as it was because it hasn't obviously changed hands. So this is his own design for the furniture inside the building. And right at the end there, you can't see, but I mean, I think this is the same view, the same interior. And it's Frank Lloyd Wright entertaining Edgar Kaufman. Edgar Kaufman is on the left and Frank Lloyd Wright is on the right. And they were very good friends. They met fortuitously through the fact that Mr. Kaufman's son, Edgar Kaufman Jr., studied under, was a fellow. He became one of the fellowship in the early period when it began in 1933. So then through that, Frank Lloyd Wright met his parents, and then Mr. Kaufman, together with his wife, will give Frank Lloyd Wright his most famous commission, which is to build a holiday or a weekend cottage for them outside Pittsburgh, which is called Fallingwater. And here is Fallingwater. So originally, as I'm sure you well know, the commission was that the building was to look down upon the falls or look towards the falls. They never actually asked for it to be built over the falls. So there again you see this wonderful environment. This is obviously in summer with the leaves everywhere, the wonderful trees, and the Kaufmans owned the land on which this was situated, and then the story goes that he designed this very quickly with this extraordinary idea of placing the building with the water running beneath it. It was never, ever anything but a leaking sieve, apparently, because Frank Lloyd Wright was always so excited by modern materials, and he always introduced them into his buildings to the detriment of the building very often. And Mr. Kaufman is on record as saying that the house's name should be actually called Rising Damp. Alternatively, the Seven Bucket House. But it is his most famous building. It is probably one of the most famous buildings in the entire world. And it's built, as you see, completed in 1937. Now, it is severely horizontal in feel. You can see here a plan. It gives you an idea of this strong horizontality with these huge concrete beams stretching out from the central core, and the water running underneath. building, in fact, was estimated originally to cost about $35,000. Again, you have to add on a couple of noughts, you see, to that. But it was estimated to cost about $35,000. That never ever employed Frank Lloyd Wright if you wanted a cheap building. The eventual cost of the building was $155,000, which was 5 times as much. And in a recent project, because the beams were beginning to wobble a bit, they were beginning to drop a bit, very frighteningly. And so from about, I suppose just over 10 years ago they began this huge restoration project, which is now finished and now complete. And the restoration project, to rebuild the house virtually, cost $11.5 million. They don't come cheap, these buildings now. They don't come cheap. So here, he would never ever, of course, admit to anybody's influence in his life at all. And some of you have quite evidently seen some classical influences and Renaissance influences in his work. But that was, I suppose, assumed by Frank Lloyd Wright, that you would know about that. But he never ever admitted that he was ever influenced by anybody, except perhaps Sullivan, his Liebermeister. But there is a drawing which he must have known about. He was a very, very well-read man. He was extensive in his knowledge, and particularly in his knowledge of any building in the world. He would undoubtedly, somehow along the line, have seen a drawing, a sketch, a design like this one. It's by the French architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux from the late 18th century. It was totally unrealizable then. It was one of these visionary buildings, because in those days, without the use of concrete, you couldn't possibly have structured a building with the river running right through it. But it was one of these fanciful, ideal buildings by Ledoux and others. It was a very rare era in the late 18th century in France for these fanciful, imaginary buildings. But here, this obviously influences the falling water, but nevertheless it's a one-off building. Here you can see these big concrete beams, the concrete slabs, which are painted a sort of light ochre to align with the landscape, to align with nature, and the only other strong colour is the red of the framework of the windows. He loved red. And some of you have asked about the fact of what the wood that he uses, and it's almost invariably redwood. And he loved red floors as well. In fact, when he was designing, or when he eventually was coming to the end of the designing and building the Guggenheim in New York, he said that they should be painted bright red. And everyone, by then, it was quite evident that he was on his last legs, and they said, yes, that's a very good idea. And of course, never ever continued with the thought of building it bright red, painting it bright red. Anyway, there's a strong horizontality, and there's big beams which project out, giving, of course, the overhanging shelter to the people below, giving the area to walk on for the people on top. And a lovely fanciful touch is the staircase there, which leads you down to the river. And you can see just a detail here. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Bother, sorry. I'll go next. The staircase leads down. Obviously, it's a completely and utterly impractical thing, this, because it'd be an absolutely a disaster if you started paddling around. You'd be swept away by the river and over the waterfall. So it's just a lovely sort of fey, fanciful idea that you could sort of come down here and just generally be in nature, watching the water flow by. Heavens alive, hopefully nobody would. Fortunately, the Kaufmans only had one child, and he was obviously carefully chained to the bed, I think. I don't know. But, and then, in fact, to finish the story, Edgar Kaufman Jr. then leaves the house to a preservation trust in Pennsylvania, and which is now the owner of the house. And it remains, therefore, unusual for his houses. It remains exactly as it was originally created at this time by Mr. and Mrs. Kaufman. The ornaments are virtually in exactly the same position, etc. So, but there's one of his lovely fey ideas. We'll see another one in a minute. So then, this is the great living room. this wonderful, huge space that you come into, where, again, you see you've got the water underneath, you've got this noise of the gushing waterfall, you've got the big, big expansive windows, and then the stone floor, which, of course, is using stone from the local quarries, and he specifically wants it to be highly polished to give this effect, basically, of a sort of a watery environment that you have here. The stairs down to the water are just over, they go down from there. Then there's the desk, it's built in for him and her, Mr. and Mrs. Kaufman. And then in the far right, there's a big red blob, which I'll just show you a detail here. It was one of these amazingly impractical, totally exotic designs of Frank Lloyd Wright. It was meant to be a huge container, a circular container, in which you could then swivel it on those pulleys that you can, on those supports there, and you swivel it round into the fireplace itself, and then you then hit the glue vine in the container. Well, according to Mr. Kaufman Jr., it was only used once, and it took 7 hours to heat, so they never used it again. So it's just simply a talking point now. But what is fascinating, and what is, I think, so exciting, is that actually those stones there are actually part of the bank. If you took away the rest of the building, those stones would still be there, because it's part of the whole structure of the bank on which the house stands. So this is literally bringing in the stonework, bringing in nature into the environment, into your home, with, of course, your hearth as the sort of warmth of the hearth as well. Again, you can see the glue vine container there now. I can't see, I've got it at an angle. Anyway, it's just over there. Now, interestingly, the cushions, because all this is original, but obviously a lot of it has been restored, the cushions were made of Dunlop pillow. Now, I mean, it was the most unsuitable thing, really. But again, this was brand new. This was cutting-edge technology at the time. This was so exciting that he could use this new sort of pudgy material for the Dunlop pillow lining of these cushions. The dining room table, rather insignificant over there. And then the ornaments as they were placed originally by Mrs. Kaufman, sort of treasured family ornaments from various expeditions and whatever. This huge, wonderful, big open space of the living area itself, of which, first of all, there's the plan. You can see there, as usual, there's the bridge that crosses what is called Bear Run. Bear Run is the river. Mill Run is the area. So it's a bit confusing, that. But the Bear Run is actually the river, which then flows, as you see, under the bridge and under the house, down the waterfall. But then you go over the bridge to then enter the house through the loggia there. It's, again, sort of his extraordinary obsession for concealing the entrance to the house. But actually, in this instance, it works very well, because you go across the water, and then you enter the house to look down onto the water, which is fine. And then off the living room area with the terrace, as you see, on the left-hand side. Off at the top there is the kitchen. Of course, it's always this so-called laboratory that he wanted. It was small and rather sort of pokey, the kitchen. Again, with a big stone sort of base there, which, of course, is part of the bank itself. The Argus stove is not original, but it is the sort of stove that would have been there when it was originally built. And look at the windows that open outwards, and they open outwards on both sides and then close perfectly together to give a corner to the building. Here you can see, Oh, then this is Mrs. Kaufmann's. This is in the master bedroom. Of course, the bed is always very insignificantly placed behind. But this is where Mrs. Kaufmann's desk would have been. This is her desk. It's a portrait of her son on the desk table. And then using the stones which have been quarried in the environment, in the local environment, local stonework, using them as a reflection of the design of the house, of these great beams of the house itself. The upper one supporting a beautiful Madonna and Child, which was purchased by Mrs. Kaufmann on one of her travels to Europe. It was one of her favourite pieces. It's a 14th century Madonna and Child from France. And then Mr. Kaufmann's study is on the next door level where his son's room was. And you can see the windows as they open out completely here. They open out completely, and then they would close perfectly. Well, the theory is they would close perfectly to an exact join in the middle. Rather strangely again, sometimes it's so impractical, to allow the door to be opened, he cuts a huge section of the desk out from the surface. So, I mean, imagine if you're writing something and the pen drops, or the ink drops, or the computer drops, or, well, there was no such thing in those days, but it would be very, very inconvenient. Poor Mr. Kaufmann, well, perhaps he never did any work here. But it's purely for show, really. And there again, here, we can see the house. It was extraordinary. The day I was there, which was in June, late June now, it's last June, 1917, and we'd had the day before the most torrential downpour in Pittsburgh itself. It was the tail end of a cyclone which had come up from the Gulf. And I thought at the time when I saw this rain pouring down, it just came down in buckets for hours and hours on end. I mean, it was non-stop. And I just thought, oh, heavens, if only a little of it could go to Cape Town. But it was extraordinary. And so when we got there the next day, the river was, according to the guide, was flowing as fast and as furiously as it's ever been known to flow. It was just absolutely pumping, the water was pumping out. And there you can see the photograph there. So this, obviously, is completed in 1937, only used by the Kaufmanns, the three of them, by Mr. and Mrs. Kaufmann and then their son, and then he gives it to a preservation trust. It remains, obviously, his most high-profile building of any, really. And it rejuvenates and resuscitates his fortunes to such an extent that then, in the very first month of 1938, he's on the front cover of Time magazine, and is aged 70. And by all rights, he should be winding down by 70. And because of falling water, and by the way, it's never in the plural, it's just falling water. Falling water, because of falling water, which is in the Time illustration there up above, he will design some of his most famous buildings in his 80s and 90s. It's quite extraordinary. And what is also very fascinating, it's if you're sort of pro Frank Lloyd Wright, he was by that stage being written off by the young architectural fraternity of the time, most particularly a man called Philip Johnson, who became a great modern, postmodernist later on. But Philip Johnson at the time was a young new guy on the block, new kid on the block, and he was very critical of Frank Lloyd Wright. And to the extent that Philip Johnson was involved in an exhibition of modern art at MoMA, the Modern Art Museum in New York, and they excluded Frank Lloyd Wright, which was very, very unfair, basically. He was absolutely furious. And so therefore, suddenly he gets this new lease of life from this extraordinary building. And all credit must be given to the Kaufmann family for accepting his eccentric design, which really rejuvenated all his fortunes. Now, in contrast, in the same year, in 1937, he builds what is called the Usonian house. It's a rather sort of pompous word, really, but it's US stands for United States. And in other words, what he's trying to do is build a house for everyone. We're building an ordinary little house that everyone can afford and can live in. And the challenge came from this man, Herbert Jacobs. Herbert Jacobs was not a big tycoon or anything like Mr. Kaufman was. Herbert Jacobs was simply a newspaper journalist. And they obviously were friends, and Herbert Jacobs challenged Frank Lloyd Wright to build him a house that only cost $5,000. And this is what he did. And so therefore it's called the Jacobs first house, because then the Jacobs moved to another house, so that's called the Jacobs second house. So the Jacobs first house is seen here. It's a house for every man. So every man has a car, so he drives into what is a carport. Frank Lloyd Wright was totally against garages, although he loves cars himself. He said that Detroit thinks that the car is a horse, that he needs to be stabled every night. And he said, no, cars don't need to stand out of the... But I think he's being very impractical, because in the winter times in Wisconsin and Illinois, the cars must freeze up completely. Anyway, that was the problem. That was something that he didn't think about. But that's simply a carport. Then there is the wooden back of the house. It's built on a concrete slab. Underneath the concrete slab are pipes that heat the house. There's a brick wall there. And that is the Usonian, the sort of image of a small building, which actually it's an L shape. So there's the carport. You come through the entry into the living room, and then there's a dining alcove. There's no dining room as such. And don't look at it. It's not called kitchen. It's called workspace. Bath, and then two little pokey bedrooms. Well, not big anyway. They're sort of perfectly adequate bedrooms. So this was So here you can see the house from the garden, and it's all glass and a flat roof, of course, to minimise the expense. And what is, you can see the brick used on the corners, and otherwise these the windows fold backwards, and there's just one single living room, that is the dining area, and then the bedrooms on the L, on the upper part of the L. The wood, of course, is redwood. The redwood ceiling, the fireplace in the centre as usual. The wall, obviously, well, in this instance, is for books. It doesn't have to be, I suppose, but it's obviously a big bookshelf on the left. It's privately owned, by the way, by a professor at the local university in Wisconsin, and he does let the public visit the house by appointment. You can see the dining area, the dining alcove over there. And then again, you look at it from the other angle. So you've got here the dining table, a fixed table, with the chairs on each side, and then the workspace opposite. It basically is a sort of bed-sit, or it's not a bed-sit. It's a smallish flat, a smallish apartment building, but it obviously has a garden. It has its own privacy, and this is his idea of a Usonian building. There's top lighting again, of course, but it never really caught on. It was too minimal, I think. It was too cerebral. It was too severe, I think, necessarily to be university adapted or university adopted by the general public. And interestingly, where this is placed, in this suburb outside in Madison, across the road is one of those much more fanciful houses we saw in Oak Park. It had sort of gables and dormer windows windows and things, which perhaps actually the general public does prefer. But nevertheless, here was, I think, a very laudable attempt by a man who naturally, normally built for the very rich and the very exclusive class, and here trying to think of the needs of the general man in the street. And this was his attempt at this, and obviously supported by the Jacobs family. Now, there is a portrait of him as he's getting older now, together with a member of the Johnson Wax family. The Johnson Wax is a huge, huge privately owned company, still totally in the hands of one family, the Johnsons. And so in the 1930s, H.F. Johnson Jr., who there is on the right, was a huge supporter of Frank Lloyd Wright and gave him full rein and gave him utter support to build, first of all, the administrative building for Johnson Wax, where obviously this wasn't the factory, this was the admin building. And then after that, he builds the research building for Johnson Wax. You can visit it. They have conducted tours. They don't allow you to take photographs. But here you can see the Johnson Wax building. And hasn't it just... This was a man that originally designed Prairie Houses. Here he's completely changed, and he's now in his late 70s, now in his 70s, to changing this building, making this building this wonderful rounded sort of Art Deco space. It hugs the ground, and it has these wonderful layers, which are the lights, which are the light areas to light the interior. And here's another view of the space itself, the building itself. It needed apparently 200 different types of brick to build it. And you can see there, you can see the curved brick at the bottom there. This is Art Deco writ large. It's a wonderful piece of design. And there he is coming right up into the modern idiom, right up into the period, which of course is the late 1930s, and designing this building for the administration of the Johnson Wax Company. Obviously their factories are elsewhere. Now, obviously then you would drive into the building through the gate there. And then you'd gain access to your garage, or the sort of workers' garage. Excuse me. And here is the approach to the garage. What is interesting... Sorry, I'm just going to switch it off. What is fascinating is that you get these great pads supported on these strange columns, which have been called a ziggurat upside down. You know, the ziggurat goes from a single thing goes down in great big steps, sort of in Mexico. Here he turns the ziggurat upside down, and so the support is there, and then the column itself is on the ground. It's sort of this stiletto heel of the column. This is meant to be low. It's meant to be your compression again, so that therefore you can see some cars in the distance there. So once you've parked your car, you want to get out of it, and obviously we do. I mean, we don't linger in parking lots, so therefore it's very low. And then you go through the glass doors there into what is the great workroom. It's called, or he calls it, the great workroom. It's a typing pool. And there you can see this amazing space. It's open plan completely. It's supported by these pads. It's been called a forest. It's a sunlit glade in a forest. It's the light coming through the top. And then here these columns again, looking rather like sort of drawing pins perhaps. Looking like lotus leaves, looking like the trunks of trees. There are all sorts of analogies, but there is the typing pool itself. It stretches for half an acre. and showing the size of the company, in the first place, and showing the amazing state. He thinks of this. This is a building. This is a room that's entirely supported by these columns, but it has this interrupted space that you are looking through all the time, and what he uses here, because it's the latest technique of the time, the latest invention, is Pyrex tubing for the lights. We'll see that in a minute. And he also designs the furniture, of course. And this is an original desk, which today is in the Milwaukee Art Museum, and with an original chair. Nowadays, the desks are different. It still is used. The room is still in use. But nowadays, of course, you don't have typists. You work at your computer. But so therefore, the desks are differently designed. But and the chair was very controversial. One of Frank Lloyd Wright's quirkier ideas. He thought a chair with 3 legs was going to be suitable. He said that this was very good for one's posture. So he thought of all those young little typing girls typing away, so they'd have to keep their backs straight. But what he didn't realize, of course, is that what didn't think about, is if you then leant on the one side, the whole chair would tip over. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright was never, ever wrong. So the very understanding, amazing patron, H.F. Johnson Jr., who we saw in his photograph, who looked a very nice man, asked Frank Lloyd Wright to come and see him. He was ushered into Mr. Johnson's office. Mr. Johnson showed him to this chair, or a chair like this, showed him this chair, and started talking, and then inadvertently, by mistake on purpose, let some papers slip onto the ground. Frank Lloyd Wright leaned over to pick them up and landed on the floor. So it was defeat of stout party. After that, there were 4 legs to the chairs. I think one has to admire his fertility of imagination. Here in his 70s, still dreaming up amazing ideas for man's use. I mean, he thought this was a very practical thing. Well, of course, it wasn't at all, but that was immaterial. And then there, of course, is the admin building on the right-hand side. The globe was nothing, it's an ornament. It was part of a big expo where the Johnson wax exhibited, and they brought it back with them. But then on the left-hand side is the research tower. The research tower is one of his few skyscrapers. There's another one which is still functioning, but this is one of these high-rise blocks. Again, meeting the world head-on, meeting the modernity head-on. And so here we look at the construction of the research tower, which there's a solid core from which is cantilevered these brick platforms. You can see the brick platforms, which is the base of each floor. And so they're cantilevered from the solid core. The solid core, of course, contains the lift structure, it contains a staircase, and so on. And then the glass, it isn't glass, it's Pyrex tubing. I think I said Perspex. Pyrex tubing, which is the light source. It gives a diffused light, which is probably quite useful if you're researching. You don't want bright light necessarily, or it keeps the light an even sort of quality. But it had huge problems. You can see it closed in 1982. The reason was that there's only one tiny little spiral staircase leading up through the central core. That if there was a fire in the building, people would not be able to get out properly. So what happens is it's closed, and instead of completely ruining the whole sort of design and having a staircase on the exterior of the building, Johnson Wax have simply just closed it. It's now just a white elephant. It just stands there. It cannot be used because of the security, because of the fire hazard. The public can go into it. You can go to the first floor, and they have a little exhibit there. But that's about it. The rest of it just stands vacant now. And as long as the Johnsons own Johnson Wax, it'll just remain there as an example of Frank Lloyd Wright's ingenuity and lack of attention. It's not really his fault, because if health and safety had been in existence then, if these regulations had been in existence, he would have been obliged to build a bigger staircase. But anyway, it isn't used. There you can see an early photograph of the lift, and of course you cannot use lifts when there's a fire. And then you can see the research benches round the sides, and then you can see the light. Here's a better photograph. You can see the light is this Pyrex tubing, which is all well and good, all very well and good. I mean, it's a clever idea. It's a wonderful light that comes through. It's a sort of sympathetic light. But the water got between each tube, and it just became a sort of Niagara Falls all the time when it rained. So there were terrible practical problems. What is interesting is that this exhibit now that they have, it wasn't exactly like this photograph that you're not allowed to take photographs, as I say, these are all taken from the internet. But I think it would be fascinating if you were a scientist or a researcher to see these must be very antiquated forms of scientific influence now. And they have exhibits of various maps and various plans and obviously some of their products, and it's quite an interesting display in the research tower. Now, moving on to a building, he designs in total, during his entire career, he designs 10 places of worship. One is a synagogue, which I've never visited, I'm afraid, as yet. But the rest will be Christian places of worship. And here he's designing another church for another meeting house for the Unitarian Church. It is quite something to think that the actual members of the congregation were there collecting the stones from the quarry to build the building. And I love that chap on the right, don't you? Bends his knees. But quite something. Women helping as well. There are two women there, helping in lifting these huge blocks of stone to be then carted from the quarry. I think it was in the river source, actually, the river area, to the building itself. And this is a place of worship, built after the war, 1947, and it looks like this. It's the most dramatic structure. Now, you can see it from the one angle, and then you look at it from the other side here, and you can see that the roof gives a wonderful triangular shape on the lawn itself. And he wrote about this building, and he says, as the square has always signified integrity, a big one, as the square has always signified integrity and the sphere universality, the triangle stands for aspiration. And he also writes that he felt that these huge windows open the light, or allow the light to come into the place of worship, into the meeting house. And he says that rather than cut off nature, why not allow nature to come into you and allow the light and the reflection of the trees and so on to be coming into you. So here you can see the interior space with the light pouring in. Again, everyone with a direct view to the pulpit, which is here. So everyone's got a view so that they can participate intimately in the service. And the choir or singers above. And this is just another view of it as well. Here. This light, he says, allowing you to the exterior to come into the interior. Now, moving from a Unitarian meeting house to a Greek Orthodox church. This is in Milwaukee, and it's something out of space fiction. It's science fiction, isn't it? I mean, it looks like sort of, I don't know, the Star Wars or something. It's just incredible, this amazing structure, which, of course, uses the cross, the square, and the circle. And of course, the Greek Orthodox cross is an equidistant cross. Each of the four sides is the same size. And so therefore you've got this perfect cross of the building. The building will sit in a square. And then the wonderful dome, which is the shallow saucer-type dome, is obviously influenced by the early churches in what is now Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. And actually Frank Lloyd Wright went to Istanbul specifically to study the churches there before completing this building, which actually, as you see, is 56 onwards. He dies in 59, so it's completed after his death. And here is the cross and a detail. The roof rests on these little lights, these little open spaces, this scalloped effect. And you can see it inside here. You can see the light coming in. And there again, you can see it here, with the light filtering through. He, of course, will have designed everything. He designs the icon screen, which, as you see in the center there, and then again, the levels for the congregation. They've got their boxes up above for more seating and so on. Now, what you see, obviously, that is the Annunciation itself. It's called the Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church, the Church of the Annunciation, with the angel coming to the Virgin, who is in that icon there, telling you the name of the church. Above are usually local saints in these compartments. They're usually more localized saints. And you can see the shape of them. They've got little triangles at the top and the bottom. And here you can see these paintings which were created for the church by Frank Lloyd Wright's assistant. At the end of his life, he had a very loyal, very wonderful man called Eugene Masselink. And Eugene Masselink was also a designer and an artist, and obviously, therefore, Frank Lloyd Wright said to him, well, you designed the icons. They obviously the church didn't like them. The whole point of orthodoxy is that you don't want any change. The whole definition of an icon is it remains unchanging. So therefore, to have these modern ideas of representing the Christian faith was just not satisfactory. So I think the minute Frank Lloyd Wright died, they took them all away, and they put them now in the basement. They haven't thrown them away, but they've just kept them. But they obviously didn't like them very much. But what's interesting is that there is, he's known as Gene Masselink, with Frank Lloyd Wright. There are some of the young fellows taken in 1938. And there's Masselink, who by then was Frank Lloyd Wright's assistant. And what is interesting is that he was born in Cape Town. Gene Masselink was born here when his parents came through Cape Town in 1910 to go for his father to become the professor of dentistry in Pretoria. And they remained only for a short space of time. He was back in America by the age of 3.5, so he didn't have a very long time here, and he won't remember a single thing about it. But there he became this absolutely loyal assistant to Frank Lloyd Wright for the rest of his life, and then, in fact, remained loyal to the whole spirit of Frank Lloyd Wright and sat on the boards and so on after his death. But tragically, he died very young, in the 50s. So he would have been involved, of course, at the end with Frank Lloyd Wright's last great work, which is the Guggenheim. And there is a photograph taken in the 1950s of Frank Lloyd Wright, with the woman in the center is Hilla Rebay. I don't know if she pronounced it Rebay or Rebay. And she was the artistic advisor to Solomon Guggenheim, who's on the right. And when the building is completed, Hiller, will become the first director of the Guggenheim Museum. So there's the three sort of driving forces of the Guggenheim itself. And what was fascinating is that Frank Lloyd Wright's brief was that the Guggenheim Museum should be completely unlike any other museum in the world. And that was what he was told to build. So what he's building, actually, if you look at it, with that spiral effect, but it goes down in size, it's bigger at the top than at the bottom. It's exactly the same as those columns in the Johnson Wax building. And they are, or in other words, again, it's an upturned ziggurat. So that is a sort of inspiration that you see there. He liked the idea, obviously he was very keen on this commission, but what he really liked, and you can see some branches coming in on the right-hand side of the photograph, that in fact the Guggenheim faces onto Central Park. So that although you can't see the Central Park from the building, because it's all wall, but nevertheless, you were again within the natural environment. The Central Park was there, sort of within touching distance at any rate. And so there you can see the shape of the building as such, reflecting his new spirit of adventure. He will be given the commission in the 1940s. It'll take 16 years from the time he received the commission to the time it's complete. The reason being that the design was so revolutionary that the authorities in the New York Planning Department refused to pass the plans. And it involved a lot of endless going backwards and forwards and discussions and minor alterations and so on and so forth. It was quite a sort of mind-boggling effect for Frank Lloyd Wright. When he was in New York, he lived in a suite nearby in one of the smart hotels, and sadly he dies within 6 months. He dies 6 months before the building is complete. There again you can see the interior. Now it was hugely criticized at the time, but it still is not wholly successful for a view of modern art, particularly modern art, because they're huge in size, and you can't step back from them. You walk around this spiral as you go up, like in the interior of a shell. You go round and round and round and round up to the top. Top lit, of course, but nevertheless you can't actually see the paintings with any great vision. But basically, and this was the argument then for many artists, including one or two quite more famous ones at the time, saying that the building actually will dominate the art, the building will be art itself, and that's exactly what Frank Lloyd Wright wanted, so that's perfectly all right. It is a work of art, and it is basically all credit to Solomon Guggenheim that he knew this would happen. He wanted something to be completely different. He wanted something to be utterly new in its concept, and he got it. And he got this amazing building. And of course it is now hugely successful, even though you can't see the art all that well. But it has very, and there are other rooms are now extending. You don't only have to see the paintings in this environment here. There are other spaces. And of course now they've created a whole series of minor sort of mini Guggenheims elsewhere. The most famous is the one in Bilbao in northern Spain, designed by Frank Gehry. But and then there is meant to be another one opening in Abu Dhabi, but that's rather floundered at the moment, I think because of the fact that the oil money is not coming forth anymore. Or the oil's not coming forth. But the interior space, as I say, is very much the essence of his design, and I think, as I say, he was rather pleased that it didn't work properly. But here we can see the building in 1959 when it is opened. In 59, there with the funny old cars as they were then. And there he's standing with the Guggenheim, you see, just under completion there. But He dies in his 92nd year, and he dies leaving an extraordinary legacy. The way he managed to change, like a chameleon, he changed himself through the century, really. And he overcame all sorts of these huge problems he encountered to still remain a sane sort of individual. I mean, he was a man of extraordinary egotism, but nevertheless, I think he was one of the most famous, he is certainly the most famous architect that America's ever produced. He's one of the most famous Americans, basically. And he's a very, very wonderful man. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.